Welcome back to the How to Japanese podcast. This is the Murakami season. This is the final episode. 大変お待たせしました. Really sorry for the delay. It's taken me quite a bit of time to get to where I am now. It's been, I think, over 2 months at this point. But I read the book, The City and Its Uncertain Walls. It took me about 25 days, and I was reading at that pace was 26.4 pages a day. That compares to about 45.6 pages a day when I read Killing Commendatore back in 2017. I read at 55.5 pages a day for 1Q84. For both of those books, I was able to really kind of wall off some time and just read straight for a couple weeks. With this one, I ended up having to do some traveling for Golden Week. Otherwise, I probably would have been able to maintain that pace for that first weekend. I was able to read at nearly 100 pages a day, definitely over 50, 60. It was a relatively easy book to read, I would say, especially compared to both of those books. This one was much lighter in terms of sentences. I did not keep track of Tsukuru Tozaki, but it took me a lot longer because I was in grad school when that came out in 2013. And I was also in the process of moving from New Orleans to Chicago. So I don't think I read a part of that, and then I had to kind of graduate and move. And so I wasn't able to kind of measure a pace as I was with these last couple books. I was also distracted by Tears of the Kingdom. The past month, I'm probably about 110 hours into that. So I think that tells you kind of where I've been spending most of my time. But I've been slowly plugging away on my review, and I will publish it simultaneously with this podcast episode. I'm going to put the review on Medium, and I will put out a Substack post as well. And I'll put those links on the blog with the episode notes for this episode. So as I did with some of the introductory episodes this season, or the introductory to the release of the book, I'll go through my thoughts about the book on 3 different levels. The first will be totally spoiler free. The second will be slightly more specific, with still no spoilers, I would say, but slightly more detail. And so if you want to skip that, you can leave the podcast at that point. And then after that, I will do a complete spoiler fest and go into a detailed summary of the book and why, unfortunately, I think it is one of Murakami's worst novels. I realize that probably contradicting. I re-listened to the last 2 episodes of the podcast in preparation for this episode, and especially the immediate reaction after reading the first 2 chapters. I was very high on the novel, I think, and man, it really did not live up to that expectation, I would have to say. So yeah, I'll go ahead and get started. So again, yeah. So if you're not looking for any spoilers, I think the translation, the BBC has reported that it's coming out this year. I would be surprised if it comes out this year. I think it'll probably be next year at some point. We haven't heard any information about it yet. But if you're looking to read the English translation with no spoilers, then really just listen to the next couple minutes. And again, I will give some clear signals for when to head out. So my big picture overall thoughts is that it's really not a very good book. I would say it's boring. It's very disorganized. It's kind of floats from one idea to the other between different sections. It doesn't really flesh anything out other than the narrator's kind of internal thoughts about himself. A bit of a mess, to be honest. And I think that shows in how the book's organized. It's told in 3 parts. I don't think that's a spoiler. Those 3 parts are not as well structured as Horrible Wonderland. Part 1 is chapters 1 through 26. 2 is chapters 27 through 62. And 3 is chapters 63 through 70. And the page count breaks down as 184 pages for part 1, 412 pages for part 2, and then just 55 pages for part 3. So you can see he's really just kind of quickly trying to wrap up in that third section, and then that second section kind of goes a little bit long, which is, so ironic because Hardboiled Wonderland is really the best structured novel that he's ever written. I believe it's 40 total chapters with 20 told in each world, into the world and Hardboiled Wonderland. And so in that sense, just very clean. It comes together so nicely, and that just doesn't happen with this book, unfortunately. It feels very much like earlier Murakami in many ways, but then especially in the beginning, in part 1, part 2 then starts to feel more like a modern Murakami novel, and then part 3 is just the same thing. And so yeah, I mean, I think that's basically all I have to say about it. A very general idea. In terms of the last couple of books he's written, it's very different. He's not going into very detailed sections about world history, which is, things that he did in 1Q84 and in Killing Commendatore. He didn't do that in Tazaki Tsukuru, but he doesn't do that here. That's something that he's done in a number of his books. Doesn't do that here. So in that sense, it's not as dense. It doesn't feel as dense, the writing, as some of his other big novels, but it has a kind of breathless, parenthetic feel to it. The narrator is using a lot of parentheses, a lot of kind of breathless sentences that create this kind of feel like he's reaching to describe something that he can't quite describe. So yeah, I guess at this point, I'll go ahead and get slightly more specific. So if you don't want any information, go ahead and you can check out now. But it's this next part. I won't spoil anything, but I will give a little bit more specific information. So the part 1 feels very much like 1980s Murakami. And he's narrating these characters that don't have names. He's talking about characters in their teenage years. And it's kind of, it could very easily be the adolescence of one of the narrator in his first couple of novels. That Boku narrator very easily could have had a childhood that's and a first love described as it's described in part 1. Part 2 then is a tremendous shift. It goes from being kind of this vague point of narration, timeless, to very clearly being set in real world Japan, full of details, realism, and at times using Murakami's method of third person narration, in which the first person narrator tells the story of someone else, allowing for third person narration, which is, I think, a smart technique, because it gives you some relief from that relentless narrator, from that relentless ego of the narrator. I think you get out of that narrator's head and into somebody else's experience. It forces the narrator to be empathetic, I think. So he does that. It's a smart choice, but doesn't really tie it back to anything, I don't think. It's and I guess one thing I should have said from the beginning is that he's rewriting the novella. I kind of went in wondering, is it going to be connected to Hardboiled Wonderland? Is it going to be a sequel? Is it going to be a rewrite of Hardboiled Wonderland? But no, Hardboiled Wonderland was the direction he went from that initial novella. He went off in another direction from that novella. For this book, he kind of goes back to the novella and does a rewrite of it, and then goes off in another direction, basically. And so huge chunks of part 1 are verbatim from the novella, with significant changes, obviously. um, and he takes another story and kind of intersperses it with the novella, as he did with Hardball Wonderland. With Hardball Wonderland, obviously, that story was this data agent story set in Tokyo. With this new one, though, it's a very different story. He's the town in Harbor Wonderland is one type of metaphor, and the city in this novel is a very different type of metaphor. But they're both metaphors for something, I think, that Murakami believes very strongly. So, but yeah, he's essentially kind of going back to that initial idea that was the seed for the novella, and that's his starting point. Where he ends, though, I think it's a completely different spot. I think he's obviously writing like he normally writes, which is, just kind of automatic and seeing where things end up, and then trying to clean it up. But he doesn't clean it up well. It doesn't really tie everything together at all in any kind of satisfying way. It's not something he's really been concerned with, to be honest, as a novelist for a long time. You could even say that about the Wind Up Bird Chronicle. But even then, there's some kind of resolution there. He makes an attempt. An attempt was made, as the kids like to say. And here, though, it doesn't feel that way. It just feels like towards the end, he's doing what he's done in a lot of these books, which is just go into more specific discussion about the magic realist elements in the novel rather than the characters that create the dramatic moments. So I guess that's probably about enough of the mildly spoiler-free, more general conversation. So now I'll give us a summary of the book, which I give in detail. This was probably the most challenging. So yeah, if anybody doesn't want any spoilers at all, you should probably leave now. But this will be my discussion of the summary. Writing the summary was really challenging. It took me a long time, and I'm not even sure I'm pretty confident I understood everything in the novel. There were some things that I realized later on that were just extremely subtle or not well fleshed out, and very minor, and you could easily overlook. But I think I did get it for the most part. So, but yeah, I think I managed to do a relatively decent summary in my review, but it did take me about 1,000 words, which, I mean, I struggled with that in Killing. I still remember writing the review for Killing Commendatore for the Japan Times, and that ended up, the total word count there was like 1,000 words. And so I think I managed to do a summary in like 400 to 500 words, which for that novel is nuts given everything that happens. And I don't know. Sometimes I think that summarizing Murakami's, it's a futile exercise, just because I think the point is, like, reading the novel is summarizing it to a certain extent. Like, I think that's kind of the way he writes, is that he doesn't write to be summarized. It's almost impossible, I think. But we'll try and do it. So here we go. So in part one, Murakami is loosely alternating between two different stories, just like he did in Hardball Wonderland, except it's not as organized. There are parts where you'll have a couple chapters in a row from one side of the story, and then he'll kind of get back into this alternating thing to kind of create some dramatic moments at the end of chapters. One half of the story is set in Japan. It's not clear immediately, but it becomes clear that it's modern Japan. It's the narrator's a nameless 17-year-old high school boy, and he meets a 16-year-old high school girl. And it's narrated in second person. He calls her Kimi, you. They meet at a writing competition. They start dating. They write each other letters, and they fall in love over the course of a summer vacation. They see each other, not every week, but a couple times a month. Sometimes he goes over to her place. Sometimes she comes to his town. They don't have apartments they can go to, but they're spending time in parks, things like that. It becomes clear that this Yu character is one of Murakami's kind of emotionally troubled or complicated women characters. She freezes up. Kokoro ga kowabaru is the Japanese. So her heart literally her kokoro stiffens. And this is concerning for the narrator because he's deeply in love with her. And this section is alternated with the novella, which is The End of the World from Hardball Wonderland. And some of those sections are taken, verbatim from the novella. And in that section, a nameless narrator is arriving at the city, which is, I'll call it the city rather than the town. And when I've referred to Hardball Wonderland, I'll call it the town, because that's how it was translated by Alfred Birnbaum and Elmer Luke. But the city is very much like the town, as we know it. It's kind of run down. It's seen better times. It's surrounded by a wall. There's a gatekeeper who kind of manages the place. He cuts off people's shadows. No one there has a shadow. No one there really has to work. The things that are different from Hardball Wonderland is that there's no power, and they don't really need to eat. That's kind of a detail that he adds in, that they have a meal every now and then, but that's about it. The power thing is interesting because then that totally cuts out the power station guy who was out near the woods, which was an element that I was really curious to see how he treated, and he just got rid of it. But the Yu in this side of the narrative is also Kimi, except that Murakami's using the kanji for Kimi, whereas in the real side of things, it's hiragana Kimi. So this narrator's arriving there to read old dreams in the city's libraries, and Yu works there, right? So unlike Hardball Wonderland, we know the connection between these two worlds immediately. In the first chapter, I think, the narrator tells us that Yu created this world, the city. Yu imagined up all the details, Kimi did, and that he ended up helping her over the course of the summer vacation. It's one of their kind of activities, and he's very engaged in it. He calls himself an apostle, where he's asking her questions, and then she's filling out the details. And she says, "Oh, you have a place in this city. You can come here if you want it," which is what happens in the novella. In the reality side of things, Yu eventually basically disappears. She kind of is talking about this, when she has this breakdown and she's still able to meet him. She's late to one of their dates, and then they kind of walk around for a while, and he can tell she's a little bit disturbed, and she's able to kind of talk about it. But then she just kind of disappears. She says, "I'm a shadow. My real parents think they're my real parents, but they're not." And you don't know whether to read this as like, is this like a real person having this mental breakdown, or is this a magic real person who's actually a shadow and living in this reality? Do you take it that way? But either way, over the course of the reality side of the narrative, Yu disappears, and the narrator's kind of heartbroken, and this loss breaks him much in the way that Tazaki Tsukuru was broken at the beginning of that novel, when his college friends kind of abandoned him. And yeah, it's almost pathetic how much of an effect it has on him. It's his first love. He's 17 years old, and he never fully recovers from it. We get another description of him kind of living through his 20s and 30s, constantly reserving this place in his heart for Yu, this Kimi, and that prevents a connection with anyone else. He's eventually able to kind of get a job and go through college and get a job and kind of snap out a little bit, but still never really gets married until age 45, when it says he has a literal fall. He kind of feels himself fall into a hole. It's very weirdly described. It's not specific at all. He claims not to remember, but when he wakens, he's in the city surrounded by a wall. He's literally in a hole, and the gatekeeper is like, "What are you doing down there? I'm about to burn these bodies. Get out of that hole." And so we realize at that point that half of the narrative we've been reading to this point has been the middle-aged narrator going to this city that they created with each other like 28 years earlier when they were younger. And that point is not clear to that point, to this point in the novel. Murakami, his goal, I think, was to surprise readers with that revelation. But what that means is that when you read those sections, it doesn't feel like this narrator's it's not like a culminating moment for him. He's been waiting for years and years and years to reunite with this woman, that his first love. And then he finally gets to go to this city that they created together that ends up being a real place, he finally discovers. And he's not like excited or interested. He's not describing any kinds of those feelings, because if he did, then that surprise would be ruined for the readers. And so I think Murakami's priorities are way off in this section. So part one ends with the narrator, for some reason, helping his shadow escape from the city. Here, oh man, the decisions that Murakami makes describing the part of the city are just baffling. He really gets rid of all the narrative drive in this part of the novel. In Harbor Wonderland, it's so beautifully done. The narrator is clueless coming into this world, and is kind of discovering things for the first time. And his shadow knows so much more than he does. And that, I think, is really a critical element of that book. That's what creates the urgency. That's what creates discovery. The shadow is kind of holding back information from him over the course of the novel, forcing him to kind of not being too hard, worried that if he pushed him too much, he wouldn't help him. But knowing that there's all these things that he could be revealing. Whereas in this new novel, the narrator knows the city. He helped create it. And so when he gets there, he's on the ground, he's making the map, but there's no reason for him to be making the map. There's no drive. It's just kind of happening. The shadow doesn't feel like the shadow of the other one. He's just kind of like, he seems a little bit crazy. Murakami gives him this a bizarre moment where he's like imagining knots of wood on the walls, like watching him. They feel like eyeballs. And it's just a bizarre moment because it just makes the shadow seem crazy. And you don't want the shadow to seem crazy. You want to believe him so that you want to help him leave the city. But then later in that same conversation, he's telling the narrator, I don't think everyone here are actual real people. I think they're all shadows, and you're the only real person. So at any rate, I'm kind of getting a little bit off track, I would say. But the main point is that it's not really well organized, and I think that's because Murakami's metaphors are off here. So in Hardboiled Wonderland, the city was a metaphor for how an individual works in society. Society is this controlling mechanism that surrounds a person and limits what they can do, limits their individuality. And over the course of the novel, you kind of come to this frightening realization that the narrator, the Boku narrator, is playing a part in his own destruction by helping kind of evaporate the last pieces of mind, the last free will from the people in the town. And so it's just a great metaphor. And that also creates that urgency to act, to do something, to work against it. Or, as the narrator decides, as he realizes he built it, so he has to do something about it. He owes a debt to it, so he stays there. In this novel, though, the metaphor seems to be closer to the metaphor created in the novella, which is that the city is a negotiation between two people. It is a relationship. A relationship is this kind of imaginary thing that two people create together. And it's the closest that you can ever get with someone. You can never unify with someone, but it's as close as you can get with someone. And so that's the metaphor here. And so the workings of the town aren't really involved in that in any way, and not nearly as in such a clean way as in Hardboiled Wonderland. So at the end of part one, the narrator is convinced that he's going to leave too, just like in the novella and kind of like in the novel, except in the novella he actually does leave. In the novel Hardball Wonderland he stays, and so in this book too he decides to stay. I can't remember exactly what he says this time, but it's probably very similar to along the lines of Hardball Wonderland. And there's some sections that are like the novella where the wall is trying to convince them to stop them. But and then in part 2 is the section after that, and it is narrated again from reality by this nameless narrator who seems to have, despite a desire to stay in the city, been kicked back out to the reality of Japan, to his publishing job. He works as a kind of, in publishing, I think as sales or some kind of like agent for a publishing company. And being kicked back out into reality just is extremely depressing. The city wasn't perfect, but it was something else. It was, he wasn't going to be living with his heartbreak anymore. But now he's back. And so he kind of decides to quit his job. And this section becomes this kind of random journey of discovery with really heavy emphasis on the random. He kind of takes some time off to just do nothing. Then he has a dream about a library, and he kind of is like, well, based on that dream, it seemed like it was a mountain town, and so maybe I'll try and find a job at a mountain library. There's a library in his dream. He has a dream about a library, and so he gets in touch with this guy who works at the company that he used to work for, and this guy finds like 3 libraries that have jobs, and he's like, well, based on the dream, I think it was in the mountains and it was this and that, and so I'm going to go to the one in Fukushima in the mountains near Aizu Wakamatsu, which strangely enough is right near where I spent my time on the JET program. But this character is just there to help the narrator. He helps him find this. He's described in pretty realistic detail, unlike the part 1 of the novel, which is more vague. And then he's gone. He doesn't ever come back. I think that's very characteristic of the way Murakami's treating his characters in this novel, is that they're just kind of there to serve him and the narrator, and then they're gone. And so he gets a job at this mountain library in this mountain town of Fukushima, and he goes out for an interview with the director, who's this guy named Koyasu, who's in his 70s, and he wears a beret, and we find out that he wears a skirt, so he's kind of cross-dressing, although it's just kind of told as an interesting detail. There's nothing really to take from it other than that he's very independent, I would say. And so he ends up getting the job, and he moves out to this mountain town, gets rid of everything, and he's excited to just kind of focus. He gets out there, and there's this woman at the library who's a librarian. Her name is Soeda. She's the other main character, I would say, that he's interacting with. And he kind of gets into this routine. He's very isolated, very typical Murakami. He's not really doing anything. He just reads and he listens to music. And then he discovers that Koyasu is actually dead, and that he and Soeda are the only 2 characters who can see Koyasu. And which means that there's all these things that Murakami is doing in this section to kind of make Koyasu seem mysterious, and he's very heavy-handed with this description that, I've never spent any time with Koyasu and anyone else. I've never seen him outside of the library. I wonder why that is. And he's kind of hinting at something's not quite right here. And you discover late at night, when he calls the narrator to the library in the middle of the night, and he goes to visit him, that he's actually dead. And so, I don't know, just a bizarre choice. So during this time there, he kind of develops a crush on the owner of this local cafe where he goes to drink coffee and eat a muffin. He talks with Koyasu in his office. He talks with Soeda. Soeda, really, it feels like she could be running a library on her own. The narrator the only duty he seems to have is literally choosing the books that the library orders, which seems like the most boring job you could ever have. And it's all borderline like sexist that it wasn't a position offered for Soeda. And I can't remember how he narrates his way out of that, but I feel like Soeda is like, oh, I couldn't do this job or something like that. And yeah, but over the course of this kind of this part of the novel, his time with Koyasu is unpredictable. So when he gets to talk to Koyasu becomes this kind of like reassuring presence for him, a literal kindred spirit, you could say. Koyasu, he comes to learn that, was able to kind of set up a small family on his own. He's the son of this sake brewing family, and so was kind of independently wealthy. Was a kind of like late bloomer in terms of love and marriage and family, and then quickly loses his family. Their son is killed in a traffic accident, and then the wife commits suicide, and that kind of devastates Koyasu. So he ends up just kind of like wearing a skirt and running this library that he basically it's basically a town library, but he is the one funding it and running it. So one of the parts of his routine is to go to Koyasu's grave and talk to the grave, because he doesn't know when Koyasu is going to come visit him at the library next or be available to talk. And so it's comforting for him to go to this grave, and then he goes to this cafe afterwards and eats a muffin and drinks coffee. He kind of develops a crush on this local cafe owner who's never named, and he even makes a point. He's like, oh, I never asked for her name, and then forgets to again, and ultimately is never named. It's a strange choice. The way he chooses to kind of give the reader information during the section of the novel, I think, is also really interesting. When you find out that Koyasu's dead, it's the start of 3 chapters, one-on-one, the narrator just sitting in a room talking with Koyasu. And there's a little bit of a relief from that when he starts doing some of this third-person narration, but then he follows that up with like 3 chapters of one-on-one conversations with Soeda, talking with her about Koyasu and what happened. And it's a really boring, poorly executed part of the novel. That's a good chunk of part 2. Part 2 is then rounded out by towards the end by this character called the Yellow Submarine Boy. He's referred to as that, or as the boy wearing the yellow submarine hoodie, or M, not apostrophe, but star, M star. He's anonymized, given the name M, but generally he's called the Yellow Submarine Boy, who is this autistic high school age boy who comes to the library every day to just devour all sorts of books. And he confronts the narrator one day. He asks him what day he was born on, and then he tells him, Wednesday, you were born on a Wednesday. So from the date of birth, he's able to determine the day of the week that anyone is born on. So he's this autistic savant. And he learns from Soeda that, he wasn't able to make it into high school. So he just comes and reads every day, that he doesn't really have a great family situation. He has 2 older brothers that are working in Tokyo, and his father doesn't care for him. But all this is just kind of like told in exposition. None of it's written in scene or anything like that. So these characters don't really feel that real. But at any rate, while he's going through his routine, this boy who doesn't really interact with him overhears him talking to Koyasu's grave, and he overhears some information about this city surrounded by a wall that he's talking with Koyasu about. And then he starts to get interested in going to the city to be the dream reader. He ends up bringing the narrator a map of the city that he's drawn perfectly, only from having heard that. And the narrator gives him a couple of pointers about how he could improve the map, and then the boy improves the map and brings it back. And then he eventually debates whether or not to let the boy go, and the boy at first says that the narrator needs to take him, but then Koyasu tells the narrator no, the boy can go to the city on his own. So the boy disappears, and the narrator gets interrogated by the boy's father, by the boy's brothers who come, and at first he kind of keeps secrets from the father, and then he tells a little bit to the brothers about how he became obsessed with this city that he kind of created when he was a young kid. But none of this really ends up mattering, nor does the cafe owner who he goes on a couple dates with. And towards this part of the novel, one of the goals that Murakami seems to have is just representing the narrator's consciousness on the page. And so you do this thing where he's like trying to remember something or going back in time and experiencing something from childhood. But then in the last couple chapters, he just kind of ends up disappearing. He pulls a Benjamin Button and he disappears off into the farthest conceptual reaches of reality. And he's walking up this stream, getting progressively younger. And then he meets Kimi, and she says, "We're just shadows." And that's the end of part 2. It's genuinely bizarre. Part 3, then, the last 50, 70 chapters or 70 pages or so, is back in the city, surrounded by a wall, where the narrator, who has continued to serve as the dream reader, and we realized that at this point we were following the narrator's shadows return back to reality, while the host, the Japanese word is hontai, has remained in that city. So he doesn't know anything about what's been going on with the shadow. And so he starts to notice this boy wearing a yellow submarine hoodie appearing in the city, and eventually is confronted by him in a dream. The boy tells the narrator that they must combine, and that way he can read dreams in the city, in the library. And when they combine, they're able to read more dreams than he was in the past. And the narrator then has access to this huge internal library that the boy was accumulating while he read at the library in reality. And then the boy tells the narrator that it's time for him to leave the city. And they have these kind of conversations in his inner consciousness. And then at the very end of the novel, he kind of blows out a candle and leaves reality, and that's it. And so you can see that the balance is totally off. It starts as this metaphor for a relationship, this kind of depiction of a loss of pure love and how that affects a person. And it ends with none of that. There's no interest in going back to this true love. There's no there's no union with someone else. There's no and there's not even unless you want to read the ending as a kind of saying that that's never possible. I don't know. It's not clear to me what that means, to be honest, the ending. So yeah, so I think I covered a lot of my criticisms kind of as I went through that. But some of the main things that I think that I looked at in my review are just the coherence, the overall coherence of the novel. It doesn't really tie together. Nothing is threaded through. He goes from this metaphor in the first part to kind of seeming to enjoy creating this narrator who's a different person, more specifically in part 2. And then finally in that last section, the last 7 chapters, trying to kind of create some kind of mythology for his magic realism. It just doesn't work. The other element that I thought was really kind of unsuccessful was his pop culture drops. He doesn't do anything like in the first part, but in the second part, he's starting to mention music that he likes. He makes one uncomfortable reference to Anne Frank, the Diary of Anne Frank. The cafe owner is kind of still traumatized from her uh, her failed marriage, and so she's just kind of like living on her own, doesn't really leave the house, lives above the cafe where she works, and compares herself to Anne Frank, which I thought was maybe a little much. And then at the very end, in section 3, while the Yellow Submarine Boy and the narrator are having one of their conversations, he references this book called The Papalagi, which was written by a German guy in the 1920s, but was supposedly uh, conversations that he had heard from a Samoan tribal chief and was just passing on. And of course, it was later revealed that these were all made up and that he was using that form to kind of create these stories. And in that sense, it's extremely racist and colonialist because he's prescribing all these views to these people that were very presumptuous, like anti civilization, anti kind of anti-civilization or anti-establishment almost. And this book wasn't translated into English until the 70s, and it became a very countercultural text for a long time until it was kind of like very much discredited and is not a book that you're available now, but apparently is available in Japan and is somewhat well known. But he uses it to kind of describe the way what the Yellow Submarine Boy and the narrator are doing in the town, but it doesn't really make any sense. He says he quotes a section from the Papalagi saying, "No one's ever climbed higher than a palm tree, the part of the palm tree they had their legs around," and the Yellow Submarine Boy is like, "Well, is that true? Actually, this is a very interesting metaphor." But it's not true. Maybe we're climbing out into the air. And so although Murakami recognizes in the book that it's apocryphal and not actually true, he then goes on to double down on the ideas and say that they're interesting. It's not a good look, especially given that the original author ended up joining the Nazi party. Not that Murakami is a Nazi. I think it just is almost intellectual negligence, to be honest, which is also, I think, shown in the treatment of women again in this novel. They're really just kind of portrayed as broken characters, not fully portrayed, just kind of broken people. I quote from a review of the new Dazai Osamu novel in the Los Angeles Review of Books, I think, and it's written by Terry Nguyen, who said that Murakami's not an active misogynist, but that he treats his characters with negligent cruelty, which I thought was extremely appropriate and well penned. And here, the two main women characters are and this cafe owner. And Soeda, but not really her. She's just the kind of, way to learn more about the town, to be honest. Like the character from his company was a way to get to the town. Like the realtor he meets is just a way to live in the town. Soeda is not really neither here nor there. You and the cafe owner are the only two women, and they're just not full characters, He's written a lot of women like this in the past. The two that come to mind immediately are Naoko in Norwegian Wood and Shimamoto in South of the Border, West of the Sun. Yu is this kind of mentally troubled young woman, maybe like, Shimamoto or Naoko. And the cafe owner is this woman who is unable to enjoy a physical relationship with her husband, and that causes some issues for her, which is a lot like these characters, but they're not given enough time. They're not really given enough chance on the page to do anything, and so it feels like he's just kind of, they're there to serve the narrator. And it could kind of be argued that's true for all these characters. You know, the yellow submarine boy is especially so. You know, he's just an autistic savant, and then once he goes to the town, he's this kind of magical, mysterious metaphor weaver, quoting the Papalagi, which, you know, I guess we can assume is a book that he read in the library. Yeah. So not great there, and you know, I think the one point that I should continue on with the Ultramarine Boy is that there's a lot of assumptions being made on the part of the narrator. He's like, oh, he's in a terrible situation at home. He would be much happier in this kind of unreal world of the city. But he doesn't give these characters any chance to kind of prove that. There's no scenes with the family that would make them seem more real, that would make the boys suffering in this current reality seem real. There's no, it's not complicated at all. It's just very straightforward. You just kind of take what the narrator says as gospel, and that's it. And then the last thing I'll add about the book is that on the writing level, it was also one thing that I noticed, which was Murakami uses this kind of inverted description technique. I call it tochi in the review, which is where you put something that would normally precede another grammatical element behind it. I don't know if it's exactly tochi, but tochi is something where, you know, you would say like katta yo shinsaku wo. That's the example I use in my review, and that means I bought it, the new novel. So you say first I bought it, and then you specify what you bought afterwards. So that's all kind of in one sentence in a parenthetical. Murakami's inversion is slightly different. He's adding a dependent adverbial phrase after a main sentence to further describe that sentence, how something is done. So, for example, one is, your shadow died long ago, I repeat within myself, like an echo deep within a cave. And so that like an echo deep within a cave isn't an independent clause. It's a dependent clause, or maybe it's not even a dependent clause, but it's a dependent phrase that is working as an adverb to modify how he said that phrase. And there's so many of these within the novel. You know, another one is, I stare into her eyes as though searching for the bottom of a clear mountain spring. And these are relatively unremarkable sentences, I think, especially because you don't necessarily need to render them as a second independent sentence in English translation. I think translation can be something different structurally. But when you start counting, it gets a little bit concerning. Murakami does this with noyo ni and mitai ni, two phrases that create these dependent adverbial phrases. In sentence ending position, he uses them 198 times over the course of the novel. And then I went through and counted Horrible Wonderland, and he uses them only 3 times. And so this is clearly some kind of new style. I'd be very curious to know if this is something that started earlier in Killing Commendatore and I just didn't notice. But it feels newer, and it feels like this kind of breathless attempt to kind of explain something. So it doesn't feel as particularly well penned on the macro level or on the micro level, which makes me wonder, how is it going to be received in English? You know, this is going to be one of the first times where you've got a very close comparison of 2 different novels, and you know, there is, I think, Wendy Lesser is a writer who did a close look at the different translations of The Wind-Up Bird and Tuesday's Women, and came away with some interesting thoughts about translation. But here we'll be able to see Murakami editing versus himself when this book comes out. And I don't think it's going to be received very well. We'll see. I feel like people are going to notice that the metaphor he creates, he doesn't follow through with, that he's throwing in ideas. Like he throws in the idea of a pandemic that I didn't even mention yet, that he throws in 2 instances of mentioning that. One when he's in the city in part two. In part one, when the shadow says, "Oh, the Dream Reader is here to prevent the seeds of a pandemic," and then the Yellow Submarine Boy in part two then says, "Oh, the wall is here to protect from a pandemic, an endless pandemic of the soul." But it has nothing to do with the rest of the novel. It has nothing to do with that metaphor of a relationship between two people. It has nothing to do with kind of like saving yourself emotionally for someone, of suffering loss. And I think that's going to be immediately evident. Yeah. So unfortunately, not a great novel. I thought I'd go through real quick and look at my predictions and see how those went. So obviously he did rewrite a story. I kind of predicted that a little bit. He does go to a library. Check. He isolates a character. Yes. Does he use phones? Not really. Not in the same way. He would have been able to. The narrator does try calling you. So he's not totally helpless, and he's not totally using Murakami logic, which would be just to kind of never even try to get in touch with you when she stops contacting him. But phones aren't really used in the same way as a metaphor for trying to connect with someone else. How is he depicting young women? That was something I was interested to know. And again, it's another kind of bizarre treatment of this kind of broken young woman, you. How does he end his chapters? Nothing really comes to mind. And the only really egregious one is where he ends the chapter saying, "Oh, and by the way, Koyasu was wearing a skirt," as a way to kind of try and surprise the reader. It seemed maybe slightly unnecessary. I don't know. How old are the protagonists? He really is focused in on that high school age in part one, but then he does give a pretty, normal narration of someone growing into their 40s with the narrator, and then looking at Koyasu, who is really the only other character who gets any true consideration as a man growing into his 60s and 70s. Are his characters telling lies or hesitant to communicate? Yes. So there were elements of this. Murakami's the narrator's hiding information from the father of the Yellow Submarine Boy before sharing some of it with his brothers. He also hides information from Soeda, the librarian, doesn't tell her that about this town that the Yellow Submarine Boy has gotten obsessed with. I wondered if it would have an afterword, and while I initially said it didn't, it does. It has a long afterword where Murakami's explaining himself. He talks about not truly even being satisfied with Hardball Wonderland and the end of the world, but then and wanting not really being able to kind of accomplish what he set out to do with that initial novel, and then thinking that he would be able to now. He also said that he wrote part one, let it sit for 6 months, and then wrote part two and three, which makes sense now. They feel very separate. They're not really well intertwined. I wondered whether he would go to the woods or write about that. No, that got axed. I wondered what he would do with the librarian's shadow. Nothing really. He just says that she left at age 3, and then I guess we can assume that she was thrown back out into reality. Do any other members of the town have residual pieces of mind? It doesn't end up mattering at all. And then also, I thought a little bit about humor. I was listening to my podcast. I was reminded about how funny Hardball Wonderland was, and it's all really gone from this book. There's a little bit of kind of like witty back and forth between the narrator and the cafe owner, but it doesn't feel like 1980s Murakami. It feels like it's done so. It's humor for very serious reasons. It's not this kind of actual ironic humor from ironic and satirical almost humor from that Murakami used a little bit in some of his early novels. But that's it. Yeah, I think I'm going to go ahead and end it there. I'm exhausted even just thinking about this novel anymore. I'm ready to be done with it for a little bit. I think one thing that I kind of wrote in my Substack post about this is that thinking about Murakami's ultimate interpretation and reception, it's obviously been very successful in the short term. But in the long term, like the really long term, thinking 100 years, 200 years, 300 years, if he's still being read from then, once his material goes into the public domain, it's all going to get translated eventually. And I think at that point, he'll be known as a bad novelist, a decent short story writer, and a good nonfiction writer. I think that that's where his strength lies. As a writer, he's an observer, and given the right content to observe, the right people to observe, he can put out good writing. But for whatever reason, his fiction, especially his long fiction, has had very strange priorities. What he seems to think is important in novels has changed so much over the years. Whereas I think what he thinks is important in nonfiction, I think is similar to some of the early stuff that he wrote, and continues to be strong. So I think I'll end on that note. Thanks so much. If you listen this far, if you listen to any other episodes, thank you. I appreciate it. Keep on checking the blog, keep on checking the newsletter. I'll have something out once a month. I do think I will obviously take a little bit of a break from Murakami, but I'll be back up in September, hopefully, writing blog posts about some of his untranslated material, and I'll probably continue with his travel memoir from Europe, which is excellent. So if you are interested in more Murakami, something maybe a little bit different from his fiction, check out my past blog posts about that. He has some great writing about his travels in Europe, and it's worth a read.